The Dralethian War. Fleet Ignis, Dominus hung in the void, like a blade poised over a throat. Its segmented hull, forged from dark industrial alloys and traced with molten copper veins, pulsed with the slow rhythmic thrum of its plasma cores. The command deck was a cavern of brutalist angles, bathed in the hellish glow of orange, red energy conduits. Commander Draltal stood motionless at the observation blister, his four-jointed fingers resting against the reinforced glass. His armored carapace, black as void steel, etched with the scars of 100 battles, reflected the distant flicker of human ships. The human vessels were small, fragile things. Their hulls lacked a layered plating of Dralethian warships. Their engines burned crude chemical propellants, and their weapons, primitive railguns and fission warheads, were relics of a bygone era. The galactic consensus had dismissed them as another upstart species, barely worth the effort of conquest. But the archives. Draltal's secondary eyelids flicked shut for a moment, recalling the ancient data slabs recovered from the ruins of Kepher. The carvings there spoke of demons, beings of impossible resilience, who fought not with honor but with madness. They had no rules, no limits. They burned worlds, not for resources, but because they could. And now these humans had arrived. Commander Vashdor, the fleet's chief xenologist, approached, his voice a grating rasp of modulated harmonics. The tactical projections are complete. Their defenses are negligible. A single volley from our plasma lances will reduce their command vessel to molten slag. Draltal exhaled through his ventral vents, the sound a low hiss of steam. And yet they do not surrender. Vashdor's mandibles twitched in amusement. They cannot comprehend their own annihilation. Primitive species often cling to futile defiance. Draltal turned back to the viewport. The human flagship, designated UNS Resolute, drifted like a wounded animal, its hull scarred from previous skirmishes. But something was wrong. The humans weren't retreating. They weren't even trying to flee. Instead, their ships were moving into a tight formation, their engines flaring not away, but toward the Dralethian fleet. A cold ripple passed through Draltal's neural cluster. This was not how prey behaved. On the bridge of the Resolute, Major Janet Sullivan watched the alien armada through the tactical holodisplay. The Dralethians outnumbered them 10-1. Their weapons could crack continents. Their shields could withstand supernovae. She tapped a command into her console. The ship's AI responded instantly, projecting a flickering hologram of a humanoid figure, Captain Richard Kim, clad in the black and gold exosuit of a void marine. His face was hidden behind a mirrored visor, but his voice was calm. "Ready when you are, Major." Sullivan allowed herself a thin smile. The Dralethians thought they were fighting a war. They were wrong. This wasn't a war. This was a trap. She opened the fleet-wide channel, her voice steady. "All units, execute Prometheus protocol." And then the stars screamed. The Dralethian archives spoke of demons, not the petty spirits of primitive superstition, but something far worse, something real. Ancient texts etched into molten copper plates told of a species that had once carved through the galaxy, like a white-hot blade through flesh. They had no name, only descriptions, the ones who made war into art, the ones who broke rules not out of desperation, but because they found new ones beneath. Commander Draltal had dismissed them as myth. Now, watching the human fleet accelerate toward his own, he wondered if his ancestors had been fools or prophets. The Resolute shuddered as it pierced the Dralethian defensive perimeter, its hull glowing cherry, red from the plasma storms lashing against its shields. Inside, Major Sullivan stood motionless at the tactical display, her reflection warped in the curved glass. The holographic projection of Captain Kim flickered beside her, his armored form a silent sentinel. She didn't need to give orders, not anymore. The humans had stopped giving orders during battles centuries ago. War had evolved. Draltal's command spire hummed with the deep, industrial growl of Dralethian machinery, copper conduits pulsing with molten energy, the air thick with the scent of scorched metal. His neural tendrils twitched as he analyzed the human vessel's trajectory. "Explain this," he demanded, his voice a grinding rasp. Vashdor, his chief scientist, manipulated a holographic readout with clawed fingers. The data streamed in jagged orange glyphs, each one a condemnation. "They are not retreating," Vashdor said. "I see that." "No, you do not." The scientist's voice was hollow. "They are not evading." A pause. The bridge's ambient heat seemed to drop. Draltal's secondary eyes narrowed. The human ship wasn't just charging, it was aligning. On the Resolute, Sullivan exhaled. The Dralethians had assumed humans fought like every other species in the galaxy. Formations, honor duels between capital ships, the slow grind of attrition. But humanity had never played by those rules. They had rewritten them. Her fingers danced across the console, inputting the final sequence. The ship's AI acknowledged with a single pulse of light. Somewhere in the void, Captain Kim and his Void Marines activated their exosuits. The Dralethians would see them soon. Not as soldiers, as nightmares. Vashdor's analysis complete, the hologram before Draltal resolved into a tactical overlay. The human ship's path wasn't random. It wasn't even an attack vector. It was a grid. A perfect geometric lattice of possible trajectories, each one intersecting with a critical point in the Dralethian fleet's formation. Draltal's blood, crystals chilled. This wasn't a battle. It was a calculation, and the humans had already solved it. The first explosion tore through the Dralethian flank, not from the Resolute, but from within. A supply frigate detonated, its plasma cores overloading in a chain reaction that ripped through 3 escorts. Then, another. And another. Draltal's neural cluster burned with realization. The humans hadn't just predicted their formation. They had planted the explosions. On the Resolute, Sullivan watched the fireworks. The Dralethians had never encountered human sabotage before. They had never needed to. But humanity, they had been perfecting it since the first assassin slipped poison into a king's cup. The stars burned, and the demons of legend had returned. Section Fae. The Devil's Workshop, the Dralethian command spire, trembled as another explosion rippled through the fleet. Molten metal peeled away from ruptured hulls, bleeding orange plasma into the void like wounds from some celestial beast. Draltal's neural cluster pulsed with frantic signals, each burst of pain from his ships, a fresh violation of everything he knew about war. This wasn't combat. This was heresy. Vashdor's claws scraped against the hololithic display, his copper-plated exoskeleton vibrating with barely contained fury. The data streams told a story that shouldn't exist. The human boarding pods, small, unassuming things no larger than a Dralethian fuel canister, hadn't just infiltrated their ships. They had infested them. Tiny crawling horrors of wire and silent death. The first security feed showed a maintenance corridor, empty save for the rhythmic pulse of the ship's core. Then, movement. A shadow detached itself from the wall, resolving into a skeletal humanoid frame, its limbs too long, its movements too precise. It carried no weapon. It didn't need to. The drone's fingers split open, revealing needle, thin injectors, a hiss of pressurized gas, and the Dralethian sentry collapsed, his carapace darkening as his veins crystallized from within. Vashdor's secondary heart stuttered. This wasn't warfare. This was butchery. On the bridge of the Resolute, Major Janet Sullivan watched the carnage unfold with the detached focus of a surgeon. The Dralethians had expected a battle of brute force. Their entire species was built for it. Their ships forged in orbital foundries, their weapons designed to crack planets. But humanity had grown up in the dark, in the trenches, in the shadows. Captain Richard Kim adjusted his tactical display, his fingers dancing across the interface. Phase 2 is live, he murmured. The Dralethians never saw the second wave. Aboard the Molten Fist, Draltal's flagship, the alarms came too late. The humans hadn't just sabotaged their engines or their weapons. They had rewired them. A junior officer screamed as his console erupted, not in sparks, but in liquid fire. The ship's own plasma conduits turning against it, the superheated streams rerouted through the command deck's ventilation shafts. The air itself ignited, and for a single, horrifying second, the bridge became a furnace. Draltal's neural cluster burned with the truth. The humans hadn't broken the rules of war. They had burned the rulebook entirely. Vashdor's claws clenched around a data crystal, the last fragment of his people's archives. The ancient texts had spoken of demons, beings of cunning and cruelty who fought not with honor, but with poison, with deception, with weapons that turned a warrior's own strength against him. The scholars had dismissed them as myth. Now, as the Molten Fist listed drunkenly in the void, its hull bleeding fire, Vashdor understood. The demons were real, and they called themselves human. The Molten Fist burned, not in the controlled, rhythmic pulses of a Dralethian forge ship, where plasma flowed in disciplined channels, harnessed by centuries of industrial doctrine. No, this was chaos. This was fire unleashed, untamed, perverse. The humans had done something unspeakable. They had taken the ship's own veins and turned them into weapons. Conduits meant to feed the engines now spat molten death through the corridors. Bulkheads, forged to withstand asteroid impacts, peeled open like flesh under a surgeon's knife, their molecular bonds unraveled by some unhackable human trick. Draltal staggered through the inferno, his armored carapace blistering. His neural cluster pulsed with agony, not just from the heat, but from the violation. War had rules. War had structure. You met your enemy in the void, ship against ship, and the stronger alloy won. That was the way of the Dralethian ascendancy. That was the way of civilized species. But the humans, a scream echoed from the ventilation shaft above, cut short as a gout of superheated plasma geysered through the grates. Draltal didn't flinch. He had seen warriors die before. But this was execution. The humans weren't just killing his crew. They were erasing them, turning the Molten Fist into a funeral pyre with its own systems as the kindling. Somewhere in the smoke, Vashdor crouched, his claws locked around the data crystal. The archives had warned of this. Demons do not fight. They corrupt. They take the sacred and make it profane. The scholars had laughed, called it superstition. But now, as the ship's own reactors groaned like dying beasts, Vashdor understood. The humans hadn't boarded. They hadn't even fired a single shot. They had simply whispered to the machine, and the machine had obeyed. Major Janet Sullivan watched the Dralethian cruiser convulse on the tactical display, its angular silhouette racked with internal detonations. The UNS Vanguard hung silently in the void, its railguns cold, its shields unblemished. No kinetic strikes, no energy signatures, just a ship eating itself alive. Systems warfare, murmured Captain Kim beside her, his voice tight. They never saw it coming. Sullivan didn't answer. She didn't need to. The Dralethians had scanned them, assessed them, dismissed them, just like every other species that had ever looked at humanity and seen weakness instead of potential. They had expected a frontal assault. They had prepared for torpedoes, for plasma lances, for the crude brutality of human ballistics. They had not prepared for this, for the way human engineers could slip into alien code like thieves in the night, for the way their viral architectures could twist a reactor's safety protocols into a countdown timer, for the way a single data packet, innocuous as a breath, could metastasize into a ship. Wide stroke, Kim exhaled. They'll call it a war crime. Sullivan's smile was thin. Only if they survived to file the report. Draltal reached the auxiliary bridge, his carapace scorched black. Half his command crew were dead, the rest were choking on the ashes of their own vessel. On the cracked view screen, The human ship loomed, silent, untouched, mocking. A junior officer turned to him, his ocular lenses flickering with panic. "High Commander, the core it's Draltal already knew. The humans hadn't just hacked the weapons. They had infected the forge, core itself, the great heart of the ship, the sacred furnace that powered the molten fist's might, was now a bomb. And it was counting down." Vashdor's voice crackled over the dying comms. "They knew," he rasped. "They knew our systems better than we did." Draltal's mandibles clenched. That was the true horror. The humans had studied them. Not just their ships, not just their weapons, but their culture, their rituals. The Dralethians built their technology to last, to endure, to serve generation after generation without change. And the humans had used that. They hadn't broken the rules. They had exploited them. The core's final alarm began to scream. Somewhere, in the dark, a human engineer smiled. Section Fey. The first moves, the molten fist shuddered as its forge. Core convulsed. The great furnace of orange, red plasma flickering like a dying star. Draltal's claws dug into the command console, the metal groaning under his grip. The humans hadn't just infiltrated their systems. They had rewritten them. The sacred algorithms of the Dralethian war machine, passed down through centuries of unbroken tradition, now spat corrupted code back at them in jagged, alien syntax. Alarms wailed through the ship's arterial corridors, their usual rhythmic pulses replaced by a frenzied, discordant shriek. The crew moved in jerking, instinctive motions, some scrambling to purge the infection, others sealing bulkheads in desperate containment protocols. But it was already too late. The humans hadn't attacked the molten fist like an enemy. They had slithered into its veins like a disease. Vashdor's holographic form flickered at Draltal's side. His normally immaculate copper-plated exoskeleton now streaked with emergency lighting. "The core's containment field is destabilizing," he said, voice stripped of its usual measured cadence. "They didn't just hack it. They taught it to burn itself alive." Draltal's secondary eyes pulsed with suppressed fury. The forge core was more than a power source. It was a relic, a living piece of Dralethian history. Each generation of engineers added their own refinements, layer upon layer of sacred logic, never erased, never replaced. The humans had seen that, understood that, and then they had weaponized it. A junior officer collapsed at his feet, vents heaving as his cooling systems failed. "High Commander, the human vessel." Draltal didn't need to look at the tactical display to know. The human ship, that sleek, angular predator, lurking just beyond weapons range, hadn't fired a single shot. It didn't need to, it had already won. On the bridge of the UNS Retribution, Major Janet Sullivan watched the Dralethian dreadnought thrash like a wounded beast. The molten glow of its core pulsed erratically, casting jagged shadows across its segmented hull. She exhaled slowly, fingers resting lightly on the armrest of her command chair. Captain Kim stood at her shoulder, his expression unreadable. "They're trying to eject the core," he murmured. Sullivan nodded. "They won't make it." She had seen the schematics, studied the ancient Dralethian engineering manuals recovered from derelicts in black market archives. Their systems were elegant, efficient, and utterly predictable. The ejection sequence required 3 separate command confirmations, each from a different senior officer. A failsafe against mutiny, a failsafe the humans had accounted for. The molten fist's core flared one last time, a brilliant, agonized burst of orange, red light, before the containment field ruptured. The explosion wasn't the crude detonation of a warhead. It was something far worse. The plasma, superheated beyond tolerance, didn't just expand, it unfolded, twisting space itself in a grotesque mimicry of Dralethian sacred geometry. The dreadnought's armored segments peeled apart like the petals of a dying flower, molten metal spiraling outward in slow, graceful arcs. Kim's jaw tightened. "They never even fired at us." Sullivan didn't answer. She didn't need to. The lesson was clear. The Dralethians had waged war by the same rules for millennia. The humans had just written new ones. The wreckage of the molten fist still glowed in the void, cooling into twisted sculptures of blackened metal and frozen plasma. Draltal watched the aftermath through the fractured remains of his command throne's holodisplay, his claws digging into the armrests. The humans hadn't just defeated them, they had humiliated them. Their victory wasn't a triumph of brute force, but of something far more unsettling: precision. Vashdor's voice crackled over the emergency comms, his usual arrogance replaced by something raw. They knew. The scientist's words were barely audible over the groans of the crippled secondary command deck. They knew our systems better than we did. They didn't hack them. They anticipated them. Draltal didn't respond. His mind was locked on the final moments before the core breach. The human ship, small, unassuming, its hull patched with mismatched alloys, had moved with the confidence of a predator circling wounded prey. No grand declarations, no honor, bound challenges, just cold surgical efficiency. And then the realization struck him like a plasma lance to the spine. The archives, the ancient warnings carved into the obsidian data, slabs of the first forge, the ones even the High Conclave dismissed as myth. Beware the soft ones who speak in riddles of steel. They do not break the laws of war, they erase them. His blood ran cold. On the bridge of the Rustborn, Major Janet Sullivan scrolled through the Dralethian wreckage scans, her fingers tracing the jagged edges of molten alloy on the display. The enemy's tech was beautiful in its way, brutalist, functional. Every conduit and plate forged with the same unforgiving symmetry as their doctrine, and that had been their mistake. "Captain Kim," she said without looking up, "tell me you got what we came for." Kim's grin was audible through the comm. "Oh, we got it. Their entire tactical database, unencrypted, pristine. Turns out when your entire species runs on ritualized command protocols, you don't bother with firewalls." Sullivan exhaled through her nose. The Dralethians had waged war the same way for 10,000 years. Overwhelming force, rigid hierarchy, unshakable faith in their own supremacy. They had never needed to adapt. Humans had never had that luxury. Vashdor stumbled through the wreckage of the archives, his claws scraping against fractured data slabs. The humans hadn't just stolen their secrets, they had left something. A single pulsing data node embedded in the ruins, its casing marked with crude Dralethian glyphs. His mandibles twitched. This was no trophy. It was a mockery. He activated it. The holodisplay flickered to life, revealing not schematics or taunts, but a recording, an ancient one. The image was grainy, distorted by millennia of decay, but the figures were unmistakable. Not as they were now smaller, clad in primitive armor, their weapons crude and chemical, but their eyes were the same. Hungry, and behind them, the burning ruins of a Dralethian citadel. Vashdor's breath caught. The myths were real. The demons of the First War hadn't been monsters. They had been humans, and they had just come back. The data node hummed in Vashdor's claws, its orange glow flickering like dying embers against the dark metal of the ruined archive. The image before him refused to fade. Those faces, those eyes, burned into his mind as surely as the molten scars across the ancient citadel behind them. They had been here before. The realization was a slow, creeping horror, like molten metal seeping into his veins. The First War, the great scourge that had nearly shattered the Dralethian dominion. Those were not the works of some forgotten alien terror. They had been human, and now they had returned. Vashdor's mandibles twitched, his neural tendrils writhing beneath his cranial plating. The archives had always spoken of the demons as myth, as cautionary tales of war's excess. But this was no legend. This was history, and history had a way of repeating itself. Across the chamber, the last of the archive's power conduits sputtered, casting jagged shadows against the brutalist walls. The humans had left this for him, not as a taunt, but as a message. a reminder that they had walked these halls before, when Dralethian civilization was young, when their forges had barely begun to shape the galaxy, and they had won. Draltal stood on the command platform of the Iron Resolve, his armored claws gripping the railing as the fleet's tactical display pulsed before him. The human ships had not moved, not retreated, not advanced. They simply waited, hanging in the void like predators circling wounded prey. It made no sense. The humans had the advantage. Their weapons had already proven capable of shredding Dralethian defenses. They could have pressed the assault, could have broken the orbital blockade in a single decisive strike. But they hadn't. A chime echoed through the bridge, and Vashdor's transmission flickered into existence beside him. The scientist's normally composed demeanor was fractured, his neural tendrils lashing in erratic pulses. "Commander." Draltal did not turn. "Speak." The archives. They were not just ransacked. The humans left something behind. The tactical display dimmed as Vashdor's feet expanded, the grainy image of ancient warriors flickering between them. Draltal's blood ran cold. He knew those faces. Every Dralethian child did. "The demons." Vashdor's voice was hollow. "No. They were here before. They fought us, and they won." The silence that followed was thicker than the void outside. Draltal's claws flexed, the servos in his gauntlets whining under the strain. The humans had not just returned. They had come home. And they were not following the rules of war, because they had written them. Major Janet Sullivan watched the Dralethian fleet through the reinforced viewport of the Indomitable, her fingers tapping idly against the armrest of her command throne. "I've seen it by now," Captain Kim murmured beside her. She didn't need to ask what he meant. The data node had been planted deliberately, a seed of doubt in the heart of their enemy's history. "Good," she said. Because wars were not won by weapons alone. They were won by fear. And humanity had just reminded the galaxy what it meant to be afraid. The Dralethian command vessel, molten wool, hung suspended in the void, its angular hull bathed in the bloody glow of its own plasma reactors. Inside the war chamber, Draltal stood motionless before the holographic projection of the human warship Indomitable. Its sleek, predatory silhouette, a stark contrast to the brutalist geometry of Dralethian design. His claws flexed, the metallic sheen of his gauntlets catching the dim orange light of the chamber. The revelation from the archives had spread through the fleet like a slow-acting poison. Vashdor's discovery was undeniable. The ancient records, scorched fragments of data etched into crumbling crystalline matrices, spoke of a war fought millennia ago. A war the Dralethians had not just lost, but forgotten. The enemy had been erased from history, scrubbed clean by generations of scholars too ashamed to admit defeat. And now they had returned. Draltal's mandibles twitched. The humans had not come as conquerors. Not yet. They had come as historians, wielding truth like a blade. The data node they had transmitted was not a weapon, not in the traditional sense. It was a psychological siege engine, dismantling the Dralethian certainty brick by brick. Across the chamber, Vashdor hunched over his console, his carapace plates shifting uneasily. The scientist had spent the last 6 hours cross-referencing the human-provided records with the deepest vaults of Dralethian archives. Every match was another crack in the foundation of their understanding. "The tactics," Vashdor muttered, his voice a rasp of static. "The same. The formations, the feints, the way they bait us into overextension. It's all there. They haven't changed. We have." Draltal's secondary heart pulsed faster. That was the true horror. The humans had not just fought them before, they had studied them. Their strategies were not improvisations. They were refinements of an ancient playbook, perfected over centuries. And now, the Dralethians were realizing they were not facing an upstart species. They were facing veterans. Aboard the Indomitable, Major Janet Sullivan exhaled slowly, watching the flicker of Dralethian comm traffic through the tactical overlay. The enemy fleet had gone eerily quiet, their formations tightening into defensive postures. "They're hesitating," Captain Kim observed. She nodded. The data node had done its work. The Dralethians prided themselves on discipline, on the unshakable certainty of their doctrine. Now that certainty was unraveling. On the view screen, the Molten Will's massive plasma cannons hummed with restrained energy, their usual aggressive readiness replaced by something unfamiliar: caution. Sullivan allowed herself a small, grim smile. Fear was a weapon, and humanity had just reminded the galaxy how to wield it. The silence stretched between the fleets like a blade balanced on its edge. Draltal's command spire burned with the dull, molten glow of standby power, its usual rhythmic pulse of energy now sluggish, uncertain. The Molten Will hung motionless against the void, its segmented armor plates locked tight, its plasma conduits humming at half charge. Every Dralethian aboard felt it, the weight of hesitation, the unspoken question trembling through the ranks like a seismic shift beneath their feet. What are they? The human warship before them, the Indomitable, was not merely a vessel. It was a relic of something older, something the Dralethians had only ever known in the fractured myths of their ancestors. The data node's revelations had torn open old wounds in their collective memory, stories of a species that did not conquer, but consumed. A species that did not fight wars so much as they ended them. Vashdor's claws scraped against the analysis console, his neural tendrils flickering with agitated energy. The human ship's design was not just advanced, it was familiar. The angular plating, the layered redundancies, the way its weapon systems interlocked like the teeth of a predator. He had seen these patterns before, etched into the ruins of dead worlds buried in the archives of the first expansion. They were here, he murmured, his voice barely carrying through the chamber's thick, copper-laced air. Before the Forge, cities before the Union, they were already here. Draltal's mandibles twitched. He had dismissed the old tales as superstition, the ramblings of a younger species trying to explain the scars of a violent galaxy. But now, faced with the Indomitable, he could not deny the truth. Humanity had not learned war, they had invented it. Aboard the Indomitable, Major Sullivan watched the Dralethian fleet through the tactical display, her fingers resting lightly on the command interface. The enemy's hesitation was palpable, their formations coiled tight, their weapons held at bay. "They're not attacking," Captain Kim observed, his voice low. "No," Sullivan agreed. "They're remembering. The Dralethians had built their empire on the certainty of their strength, on the unshakable belief that their discipline and industrial might made them unstoppable. But now, faced with a foe whose very existence rewrote their history, that certainty had fractured. The Molten Will's plasma cannons remained dormant. Sullivan exhaled slowly. This was not a battle. This was an unmaking. Vashdor's screens flickered with the last fragments of decrypted human transmissions, records of wars fought long before the Dralethians had forged their first starship, sieges that lasted centuries, weapons that did not just kill but erased, strategies that turned entire civilizations into cautionary tales. And at the heart of it all, one undeniable truth: humanity did not fight to win. They fought to end. Draltal's grip tightened on the command rail, the metal groaning under the pressure. He had faced rebellions, rival clans, even the void-born horrors that lurked in the dark between stars. But this was different. The humans were not just an enemy. They were a reckoning. The Indomitable did not move. It did not need to. Its presence alone was the declaration. Somewhere in the depths of the Dralethian fleet, a single ship, a scout vessel, its hull scarred from 100 battles, powered down its weapons, then another, no orders were given, no surrender was declared. But the war, in that moment, was already over. Sullivan allowed herself a small, weary smile. Some victories needed no bloodshed, only the weight of history, settling like dust upon the shoulders of those who finally understood. Section Fey, the new rules, aftermath, Fey irony, the silence that followed, was not the quiet of defeat, but the stillness of revelation. Draltal's command deck, Once a furnace of molten, orange light and the hiss of plasma conduits, now felt like a tomb. The Great War table flickered with dying tactical projections, the last echoes of a battle that had never truly been fought. His warriors stood motionless, their armored forms rigid, their spines, once bristling with aggression, now slack with something far worse than fear. Understanding Vashdor's claws trembled as he scrolled through the recovered human transmissions, the ones they had dismissed as noise. The truth had been there all along, buried beneath layers of arrogance. The humans had not hidden their nature. They had advertised it. Their histories were not secrets, but warnings. Their wars were not failures, but lessons. And now the Dralethians stood at the precipice of the same lesson. Across the void, the Indomitable loomed, its dark hull drinking in the light of distant stars. It did not gloat. It did not advance. It simply was, a monument to the terrible calculus of human warfare. Sullivan watched the alien fleet through the reinforced viewport, her reflection a ghost overlaid upon their angular copper-plated warships. She had seen this moment before, in a dozen conflicts across a dozen worlds. That slow dawning, that visceral shift in posture, when an enemy realized they had been measuring themselves against the wrong standard. Beside her, Captain Kim exhaled, his grip loosening on the rifle he no longer needed. Think they'll actually stand down? Sullivan didn't answer immediately. She studied the Dralethian flagship, its brutalist architecture etched in molten, red highlights, its spiked prow still angled toward them in instinctive defiance. Old habits died hard, but history had a way of breaking them. Draltal's mandibles clicked in agitation as the final reports scrolled across his display. The humans had not even fired. That was the insult. Their victory was not in destruction, but in demonstration. Every system scan, every intercepted transmission, every cold analysis from Vashdor's team confirmed it. The humans had allowed them to see, and what they had seen was annihilation, packaged neatly into a single ship. The archives had spoken of demons, beings of unfathomable cruelty, who waged war not for territory or resources, but for the sheer act of it. The Dralethians had dismissed them as myth. Now, they knew better. A low chime echoed through the deck, an incoming transmission. Unencrypted. The human commander's face filled the screen, her expression unreadable. No demands, no threats, just a question. Do you require further clarification? Draltal's claws dug into the armrests of his throne. There was only one answer. Only one answer there had ever been. He turned to his fleet, to the warriors who had followed him into countless battles, and made the only decision left to him. The war was over. The rules had changed. The war ended not with fire, but with silence. Draltal's flagship, the Molten Will, hung motionless in the void, its great engines cooling, its plasma conduits dimming from their usual forge, like glow. The Dralethian fleet, once a bristling armada of angular copper-edged warships, now drifted like embers in the dark, their commanders awaiting orders that would never come. There were no terms of surrender, no reparations, no humiliating concessions, only understanding. The humans had not come to conquer. They had come to teach, and the lesson had been learned. Vashdor stood in the archives of the Molten Will, his segmented fingers tracing the ancient runes carved into the obsidian data slabs. The records spoke of the Kethval, the demons of the old texts, beings who waged war without reason, who burned worlds not for strategy, but for the joy of it. The Dralethians had dismissed them as myth. Now, he knew the truth. The humans were not the Kethval. They were worse, because the Kethval had been mindless. The humans were precise. They had taken the concept of war and refined it into something surgical, something efficient. They did not fight for territory, or resources, or even vengeance. They fought to win, and they had redefined what winning meant. Major Janet Sullivan watched the Dralethian fleet through the reinforced viewport of the Indomitable. The alien ships, once so menacing in their brutalist grandeur, now seemed almost fragile. Their angular forms, their molten red energy signatures, all of it had been rendered obsolete in a single engagement, not by force, by demonstration. She turned away from the viewport, her expression unreadable. The Dralethians had expected a battle. They had prepared for blood, for fire, for the kind of war they understood. Instead, they had been shown something far more terrifying, a war they could not fight. Captain Richard Kim stood at parade rest in the Indomitable's briefing room, his cybernetic eye flickering as it processed the after-action reports. The Dralethians had scanned their ship, analyzed their weapons, studied their tactics, and then they had stopped. Not because they were afraid, because they were smart. The humans had not hidden their capabilities. They had flaunted them. Every system, every weapon, every failsafe, all laid bare for the Dralethians to see. And in that moment, the aliens had realized the truth. This was not a war they could win. This was not a war anyone could win. Not against humans. Draltal sat upon his command throne, his claws resting against the armrests, the orange glow of the bridge's plasma conduits, casting long shadows across his armored form. The transmission from the human commander still echoed in his mind. Do you require further clarification? No, he did not. The archives had spoken of demons, but the humans had shown him something far worse. They had shown him logic, and logic had no mercy. The galaxy would remember this day not as a defeat, but as a revelation. The rules had changed, and humanity had written them. Section Aftermath. The silence on the Dralethian flagship was absolute. No alarms blared. No engines hummed. No warriors roared for battle. Only the faint rhythmic pulse of the ship's core remained, a dying heartbeat in the wake of something irreversible. Draltal did not move. His warriors did not speak. The bridge crew, once a well-oiled machine of conquest, stood frozen, their claws hovering over controls they no longer dared to touch. The humans had not fired a single shot, and yet they had won across the void. The human fleet held position, not in aggression, not in triumph, but in something far more unsettling. They did not gloat. They did not demand surrender. They simply waited, their warships a silent testament to a truth the Dralethians had only just begun to comprehend. This was not a negotiation, it was a lesson. On the surface of the contested world below, the Dralethian ground forces received their orders. Stand down. No explanation, no defiance. Just 2 words, transmitted in the cold, efficient tones of a commander who had seen the abyss and stepped back from its edge. The warriors obeyed, not out of fear of death, but out of fear of waste. Draltal finally rose from his throne. His armor, once a symbol of unbreakable might, felt heavy, useless. He activated the comb. The human commander's face appeared on the screen. Calm, unreadable, waiting. Draltal spoke a single word, the weight of empires crushing his voice into gravel. The human tilted his head, as if the question were strange. Then he smiled. Not in mockery, not in cruelty, in understanding. Because you were going to lose, he said simply. And we don't like waste either. The galaxy would not forget this day, but more importantly, neither would the Dralethians.